Everyone, to our final story of us. Kind of wild to think that this has been a year-long journey that we have been on. So today we are going to do a review. We are going to do a little bit of modernity right now, just to make sure we are caught up. In particular, focus on sort of a 2005 and after Israel. I don't believe we've touched that at all. Uh, and then we are going to talk about the implications of Story of Us. How hopefully it has changed how we understand our own Jewish identities, what it means to be a Jew, what it has meant to be a Jew. In some ways, you'll remember that I began Story of Us, maybe you won't remember, by saying that in some ways this is a theology for me that's been presented, in the sense that this is a worldview of Jewish identity. That is supposed to provide a context for what it means to be a Jew today. So we will look at that at the end. But first, let's go ahead and just start in our moment before we do the big review. Let's talk about Israel really post 1967 and do a really quick and dirty history here. It's interesting to do modernity in our modern moment with just as little detail as we've done, centuries worth of history that were just as real as our modern moment is, but everything feels more prescient to us right here. So 1967 is the defining line, I believe, in terms of understanding the state of Israel today. That's when the borders change. After 67, Israel ends up as a military occupier. And that is a technical legal definition, by the way, even as some people push back because they are uncomfortable with it. Israel, in terms of its international law, agrees with this assessment. That post 67, Israel has been the military occupier of the regions known as the West Bank, which had previously been a part of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip, which had previously been a part of Egypt. In addition to that, there are a few other regions which were treated differently from Gaza and the West Bank. Most notably, what is known as East Jerusalem. Now, let's pause for a moment and talk about what we mean by East Jerusalem. In the simplest of senses, we are talking about the Old City, the sacred sites there. But in a legal sense, East Jerusalem is the equivalent of calling everything out to Wentzville, St. Louis, if that makes sense. The other thing that is just really important as American Jews and as Americans to understand is that you will never, ever go or want to go into most of East Jerusalem. Most of East Jerusalem is entirely Palestinian, entirely Arab, has been for a very long time, and is not an area that people who are a part of Israel proper generally go into. There's some exceptions to Israeli Palestinians. Now, you'll notice I said a part of Israel proper and not Jewish Israelis or Palestinian Israelis, because each of these regions is different. Israel said that East Jerusalem, which again was a part of Jordan, was part of the West Bank. Israel treats it differently and says that that is in fact a part of Israel proper, has formally annexed it. It's not quite the same, but the same has been done with the Golan Heights. Though every time I've ever been to the Golan Heights, people have told me, okay, enjoy it this time because it's not going to be a part of Israel much longer. But I think at this point it just is going to remain a part of Israel. These regions are different from the West Bank proper and Gaza proper. Let's talk about this difference through the lens of what it means to be a non-Jew in each of these spaces. That's one of the ways of understanding how 1967 and the occupation of these lands has changed the nature of Israeli government and democracy. Within the pre-67 borders, also known as the Green Line, also known as the Armistice Line. There are a few other words you'll find for this. But in the pre-67 borders, whether you are a Jew or an Arab, Palestinian, you are a full citizen of the state of Israel. You can vote, you get services, you get Social Security and welfare and healthcare and et cetera, et cetera. Now, there is real discrimination and racism against Palestinian Israelis within these borders. I mean, significant. But it is racism and discrimination on par with what you find with most substantial minorities in most places, which again isn't a very aspirational framing, but is much better than the other frames that we're going to be offering as we continue on in these spaces. If you are a non-Jew, a Palestinian, oh, we have a question. Do Arabs in Israel actually prefer to be called Palestinian? Yes, I am generally using the language that this population generally prefers. Palestinian Israelis refers to citizens of the state of Israel who are Palestinians, who are Arabs. Arab citizens of the state of Israel are generally known as Palestinian Israelis. That's their internal term that is used. Thank you. Great question. So that has changed and continues to evolve, just as minority representation in descriptive words changes everywhere over time. If you're in the West Bank, meanwhile, you might be a cousin or a sibling, but you were born in the West Bank, or your family's from the West Bank and not from Israel proper, and you are not Jewish. You are not a citizen of any country unless you happen to have citizenship somewhere else. And in a very real way, you do not have civil rights. You don't have a government. You don't have a representation. You live and have lived, if your family's been there for a few generations, since 1967, under a military occupation where the Israeli military determines everything about your life. You need courts. The Israeli military courts are the ones that serve you. You have complaints about how you're being treated by settlers in the region. Well, you're going to have to go into a settlement and talk to the military officers in that settlement who probably are settlers themselves. So I don't just mean that your civil rights are limited. I mean, literally, there is no such thing. You do not have civil rights, does not exist. You live under a military occupation.
Can you get medical care?
Yeah, you can generally get medical care. You have access to water and food and so on and so forth. It's not even as second-class citizens, but you have access to these things, absolutely. And on some of these metrics, like infant mortality and access to medical care and nutrition, Palestinians living under military occupation in the West Bank are higher than some of their neighbors in other Arab countries, which is one of the favorite talking points that you'll find of sort of apologists on this issue, if that makes sense, and is true.
On some issues, you can get a lawyer to file suit in the court.
You can sometimes file cases to try to change some of the policies that happen. There's a great book on this if anyone's interested, The Wall and the Gate by Michael Sfarad, who's probably the premier human rights lawyer in Israel. Really great book. It's also about the closest. Sfarad, S-F-A-R-A-D is the name of the author. It's probably the best book to read that gets you as close as you can to sort of visiting the occupation up close.
The Wall and the Gate?
The Wall and the Gate, it might be the opposite, the gate and the wall, but yeah. So...
Well, when you say they could get medical care, if you're in those areas, do you have to go through any checkpoints?
Often there's significant checkpoints, often there's significant,
so you get
yes.
medical care if you get through the checkpoints.
Correct. Well, there may be local medical care. There's all sorts of different setups in different regions. Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
There's probably hospitals in the West Bank.
Oh yeah, there's all sorts of hospitals. There's Palestinian hospitals in the West Bank too. Okay, if you are a Palestinian and you live in Jerusalem, now we're talking East Jerusalem here, your status is somewhere in the middle between these two people. Most importantly, if you are a Jew and you live in any of those places, in Israel proper, in Jerusalem, including East Jerusalem, or deep into the West Bank, you are a full citizen with full protections of the law, with civil rights, with civil liberties. And in fact, if you are a Jew living in the West Bank, often you have benefits available to you that are not available to Israelis living within the Green Line: subsidized housing, subsidized educational opportunities, etc., etc. So that's where we are at today. Let's talk a little bit about how we got there and what this looks like. So most of us have lived through the era of two-state solutions, the era of Oslo, the era when it seemed like there could be genuine national separation between two peoples and the creation of two different states. By the time you get to the end of the Clinton presidency and into the early George W. Bush years, by the time you get to the other side of September 11th and the other side of really the collapse of the Oslo Accords, when you get to the rise of the Second Intifada, Israeli society loses faith that there is a real partner for making peace. So again, we're talking, let's just call it 2005 or so, 2004, 2005. And with no faith that there can be a partner on the Palestinian side for peace for a moment, and it really only lasts for a moment, there is a view that says what we need then is separation. If we can't have a bilateral peace, we will have a unilateral peace or a unilateral separation. I've mentioned this before. David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, famously said that there are three things that Israelis want, and you only get to pick two. There is greater Israel, meaning Israel inclusive of the West Bank and Gaza and the sacred sites. There is democratic Israel, meaning a legitimate liberal democracy. And there is Jewish Israel, meaning a country that is majority by and for Jews. You get to pick two. If it's Jewish and Israeli, you can't, Jewish and democratic, you can't have the West Bank. It doesn't work demographically. If it's greater Israel, meaning with the West Bank, and democratic, then it's not going to be Jewish anymore because you've got about 50-50 in terms of the population, and so on and so forth. You keep going around. So there's a moment around 2004, 2005 when Israeli society both recognizes this and has the political will to do something about it. Ariel Sharon, who had been known as the Butcher of Lebanon, a man who certainly was guilty of war crimes, Ariel Sharon was elected as a right-wing prime minister who then realized that this was unsustainable and organized the withdrawal of Jews, of Israelis from the Gaza Strip. So in 2004, 2005, 2006, we see the process of withdrawal, unilateral withdrawal, where Israel was leaving the Gaza Strip and essentially on their own saying, Kinahara, that's Palestine, this is Israel, that's how we're going to do it. At the same time, there was the construction of the separation fence, the separation wall between the West Bank and Israel, again, controversial in terms of where the fence wall actually went. But still, it was all a part of this effort to create a Jewish state that was separated from Palestinian society and Palestinian states. Sharon would have likely withdrawn from the West Bank, except his doctor prescribed him too much Coumadin. He had a stroke, and he didn't actually die because of Israeli laws about not taking people off of life support. The poor guy lived in a coma on life support for years and years and years. With Sharon's stroke, Bibi Netanyahu came back into power. There's a couple other corruption cases involving other prime ministers in the middle. And in a very real way, since the Obama administration, there has been no such thing as a two-state politics in Israel. So it's really important to understand this as American Jews because we assume often that Israeli politics is all about Palestinians and two-state solutions and peace with its neighbors. And since 2008, that has not been true. Palestinians in two states are about as important as, I don't know, the Afghan war is in the 2020 election. which is to say not important. It doesn't make the top 20 reasons people are voting. And that's hard for American Jews, I think, to understand, and hard for Americans broadly to understand. But that is the success of Bibi Netanyahu in keeping everything at a simmer so that there's not the possibility of separation. Going along with this, we have seen an Israeli society that has shifted ever more so towards the right. Part of this is what happens when you have people who are traumatized and then generationally traumatized. The Second Intifada did this. Part of this is that the populations in Israel are not liberal democratic populations. Right? 73% of Jewish Israelis today are Mizrahi, or primarily Mizrahi, meaning 73% of Israelis, their families come from the Arab world.
Is that total population or is
Jewish. That's the Jewish population. The total population of Israel, that number is about 52% of all Israelis. So again, if 52% of your population are Arab Jews from Arab lands and not from liberal democracies, if 20% of your population are Palestinian Israelis, who again are not from liberal democratic traditions and have been traumatized generationally, which doesn't tend to lead to pluralistic societies, and another 15% or so on top of that are ultra Orthodox people, you can understand Israeli society. The other sort of figure that I give to people that I think is helpful for understanding this place is that every generation, the younger you are in Israel, and you've probably heard me say this before if you spent time with me, but the younger you are in Israel, the less liberal, the less secular, the less democratically inclined you are. So your oldest generations, Holocaust survivors, and that generation, those are your most progressive, liberal people in Israel. Their children were more religious and less democratic, and their children even more so, and their children even more so. And that's what you get today. To say it all differently, Israel today is a Middle Eastern country filled with Middle Eastern Jews.
not to mention Russians?
And Russians. Yeah, we didn't even talk about all the Russians who, Russian-style democracy. Yeah, right. You get 700,000 of them
You
or
go to the
something.
embassy, what you hear is Russian, not Hebrew.
Yeah. So today, something like 700,000 Israelis live in the West Bank. The most powerful political force in Israel is religious nationalism, religious Zionism. Dati Leumi is the Hebrew for it. These people are kissing cousins to Christian nationalists in Jeff City in almost all the ways you can imagine. I mean, genuinely. They see themselves as being a part of a messianic project. I mean, genuinely, they think they're a part of it. They're anti-LGBTQ. They are increasingly anti-abortion. They are increasingly in favor of the control of women and women's bodies. Even down to crazy stuff. Proponents of the legalization of child marriage, right? Jeff City, Jerusalem. There's an odd amount in common with them. So you end up with 700,000 settlers or so. There is, this used to be very controversial when I would say it. I think it's less controversial today. I do not believe a two-state solution is possible anymore, and I have not believed a two-state solution is possible since 2016 or so. I think all of the language we have around it is veneer at this point that lets us not deal with the reality underneath it. So let's back away again. We've gotten pretty granular for a moment. I want to back away again from a story of us kind of perspective. In 2024, in the 21st century, Jews are living with more power than we have ever had in the history of the Jewish people. We are primarily divided between two different civilizations, right? In the same way that we were in the north of Israel under Roman occupation and Babylon, and then we were in Babylon in Spain, and then Spain in the Ashkenaz, and then the Ashkenaz and spread throughout the Arab world, and then America and Israel is where we find ourselves today. Uh, Jews in the United States are absolutely more assimilated in the positive senses of that word, in the negative senses, I guess, than at any time or place in Jewish history. It's very trendy. People like to sort of say, oh, that was true of Germany too. Not even close to the level of acceptance and assimilation that American Jews have found today. I mentioned this when I talked on Rosh Hashanah, but it's really, if we can be non-judgmental about this for a moment, it's really telling that the biggest concern for the future of Jewry in America is assimilation, not violence, not anti-Semitism. And again, that's not to downplay the reality of anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism rising today, but the biggest issue that American Jews have faced, particularly for the last 30 years, is assimilation. Billions of dollars of Jewish money has gone into trying to fight the scourge of assimilation, often taken to be the same thing as the scourge of intermarriage. But even if we're just going to use intermarriage as our sort of guidepost for marking assimilation, American Jews, whether you consider us an ethnicity or a religion, are the most intermarried group in the United States. That's a sign of radical acceptance. And everything else aside, and all the other problems aside for a moment, it's worth just backing away in a story of us kind of way to say that in 2024, American Jews are radically accepted, or Jews are radically accepted in America, the greatest empire and colonial power of our day. And 40% of the Jews in the world live in a vassal state of that empire, borrowing from our earliest framings of Israel and Judea being vassal states of Assyria, but a vassal state of that American empire, and a state which on its own is a nuclear power. Right? And that's the thing about so much of the discussion having to do with Israel, and people question, well, they want Israel to disappear, and despite the protests on college campuses, Israel is becoming an ever increasingly nationalistic, right-wing, Jewish supremacist state. It's not becoming an ever more pluralistic, democratic state. And all the incentive structures are pushing it in that direction, and it has nuclear weapons. Israel, as a Jewish, illiberal democracy, isn't going anywhere. But illiberal is key. Israel is not a liberal democracy. It is not meaningfully a liberal democracy when half of the people under its control have no civil rights. Okay, that brings us up to this moment today, I think. Well, hold on. We didn't finish the Sharon piece. So Sharon withdraws from Gaza, is going to withdraw from the West Bank, doesn't happen. And Gaza, of course, becomes controlled by Hamas. This control of Gaza by Hamas, along with these sort of demographic shifts that have happened, meant that thousands and thousands of rockets every year were being sent in from Gaza to Israel. Almost every time I've ever been in Israel, I've experienced rockets from Gaza. And this was the final sort of nail in the coffin of anything looking like a left wing in Israel, anything looking like a genuine political movement for two states for two people. It has been over, and is no longer real, is not a part of Israeli discourse. It is only a part of American Jewish discourse. Okay, let's pause there and take questions, and then we're going to back away. Yeah, Steve.
You just gave me a new question. When you're talking about the United States, is there no thought that you could be politically and economically accepted and assimilated and still retain your religion? You make it sound like those things are not possible.
I'm not sure I followed the question. Say that
Well,
again.
you said there that millions of dollars have been spent on the scourge of assimilation.
Oh yeah.
Well, I mean, to me, assimilation isn't a bad thing. You know, I'm happy when I go down to Savannah and I see all those letters from presidents saying how wonderful it
Yeah.
is that we're Jewish citizens and so and have all the same rights as everybody else. It may not always have been true, but I mean, why can we not, as Americans, leave out Israel, for a
Yeah.
minute, aspire to be assimilated, meaning economically and politically, but still retain our religion and our Jewish faith?
Yes. I mean, I think that
I mean,
I think what you've done is
Hebrew Union
describe.
College used to say it couldn't be, but I don't agree with that, and CRC has never agreed with that.
I think you've described what the broad goal of most of American Jewry has been. Uh,
So
look,
are you thinking that's not possible? That if you get assimilated, you're going to lose your religion?
so let's talk about a Jewish identity a little differently for a moment. Instead of thinking of Jewish identity as a binary, let's talk about Jewish identity as thick or thin.
As one?
Thick or thin.
Okay.
Jewish identity can thicken, it can thin out as well. We're so used to you're a Jew, you're not a Jew. Did you go through conversion properly? Is your mother Jew? Throw all that out for a moment and think about the thickness of Jewish identity or the thinness of Jewish identity. If you grew up in a shtetl 150 years ago, every children's song you knew was Jewish. The language you spoke was a Jewish language. The stories that you got read in a book as a child were Jewish stories. The legends, your Cinderella were midrashim. If you went and learned, you were learning in yeshiva. 85% of your story and of your mythic world was a Jewish story. Today, that's much, much thinner in an American context, unless you're living in an ultra-Orthodox enclave. And the whole point of ultra-Orthodoxy was to say, no, we're going to put these walls back up and force this Jewishness. So generationally, we see a thinning of American Jewish identity. We just see it broadly. You can see it in the survey after survey that every generation is a little less Jewish than the generation before them. How much?
But that's no different than any other religion
Oh,
in the
sure,
United States,
sure.
except recently.
It's no different than other religions. It's no different than other ethnicities that can significantly assimilate into whiteness in the United States. So if we're going to talk about it as just a binary, every year, year after year, there are about 45,000 fewer people who say that they are Jewish and who are Americans. That's pretty steady. Every year, year after year. So
That's a lot of people.
it's a lot of people. It's a lot of people. That means that every year there's about a St. Louis Jewry worth of Jews who stop saying that they are Jews who live in the United States. Some of this is death rate versus birth rate. Some of this, again, is the thinning of Jewish identity. But also, look, if the only thing Jewish about you is that when asked on a survey, you say that you're Jewish, and then next year you don't say that you're Jewish, this is not a catastrophic moment that we're talking about. We're talking about broad sociological trends. So that's what we see, and certainly that's how Israelis and Israeli right has done the math. Broadly, it's very clear. Israelis do not believe that American Jewry will be here in 3 generations. They think there will be Orthodox Jews, and that'll be it. Toby.
To get back to what's going on in Israel, NPR had a report from one of the reporters who is in Israel, the West Bank, and all the Arab countries. He said for the first time, if you talk to Palestinians, they don't want a two-state solution either. I don't know where that leaves us, but it's just not the Israelis who don't want it. Something's got to give sometime somewhere, but who knows how.
It's not even don't want it, Toby. I think actually my sense is, and looking at surveys, my sense has been this too, that you might actually have a majority of Palestinians and Israelis who want 2 states for 2 peoples. But anyone who's looking at this on the ground hasn't been able to imagine it as a political possibility in a very long time. You can't. Here, let me show you a map of settlements. and you'll understand why. Settlements in West Bank.
Well, the settlements are all interspersed all over.
Yes.
Yes, once upon a time they were close to the green line. They aren't anymore.
No. No. Open image, new tab. Okay, here y'all go. Let me share this. And I don't know how accurate this one is or isn't.
You can't show it up there.
Oh, these are Palestinian settlements. These aren't even Israeli settlements, but let's find a better one.
Can you put them up here?
No, that's not
It's
working.
not working. Oh. So I could go in Zoom.
Okay, are you all seeing this picture right here? Zoomers?
Yeah.
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 I don't know why it's not letting me zoom in. But regardless, you look at this. This is a map of settlements and divisions of Palestinian areas in the West Bank. You can see there is no separating this into two states. This is the West Bank. This is the part that's supposed to be the Palestinian state. And at this point, there are just hundreds of settlements, and they're dotted intentionally in ways to prevent separation. And profoundly, they succeeded. And that's... I certainly don't believe it's a good thing that they succeeded, but I do believe that they succeeded and that is over. That there is no coming back from this. There is no meaningful two states for two peoples
So does anyone
at this
have
point.
an end game for all of this?
Does anyone have an end game
Well,
for
no
all
one
of this?
Netanyahu doesn't have one.
Hamas does.
Who knows? Who knows? I certainly don't have. I have no sense of political solutions here other than a continuation of the status quo in increasingly violent ways.
I think Rudy has the same.
Oh, Rudy, yeah.
There is a way. There was a solution. Rabin.
Rabin, yeah, right. And in that sense, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin was
It worked.
it worked. Yeah, it was an incredibly successful assassination. By the way, the guy who stole some people have heard me tell this story, but the guy who stole the hood ornament on Rabin's car 3 days before he was killed and said if we can get his ornament, we can get him, is the same guy who organized the tomb, the shrine to Baruch Goldstein, the awful murderer who shot up Machpelah in Hebron, and he is now the man in charge of the police.
Oh my.
That's Ben Gvir. So these people, this is the world. The Israeli MAGA runs the scene there and has for a while, and the odds of that changing are not great.
Is there any movement to give Palestinian Israelis any kind of equal civil rights
Right, have one
and
state.
eliminate the discrimination? There were years ago. There was.
Israeli Palestinians?
So they do
Yeah.
have.
Or West Bank.
Are you talking about Palestinians in the West Bank?
Who live within the Green Line.
Within the Green Line.
They
Yes.
have.
Within the Green Line, there is. I mean, it's not true equality, but Palestinian Israelis
Is there
have.
any
No, we've gone backwards on that.
So
and are going
there's
increasingly
no
backwards.
movement to let them own land.
Israeli Palestinians can own land.
No, they can't. Not if it was bought with money from the.
There's some. Yeah, there's.
I mean, that whole
Part of this has to do with there's no real land ownership in Israel. Anyways, let's not get deep into this. We are in Story of Us. We are not in Israel. Yeah.
In the name of security or anything else.
We will do more on Israel.
Yes.
Let's try to keep a broader Story of
But
Us.
But I'm looking at both.
There is no real. No. Israel is becoming an ever more right-wing Jewish nationalist
So what you're
supremacist
saying,
place.
From my point of view, there's less and less to love about Israel.
I- So okay, let's back away again for a moment. I think one of the big mistakes. I'm not going to talk about mistakes. Let's talk about this in the Story of Us perspective.
You can tell me I'm mistaken.
No, not you. American Jewish identity, we talked about this last week, has been significantly turned into Israelism and Holocaustism. Remember, we talked about some real details on this. Part of what this has meant is that there has been significant mythology of Israel that has been taught to us as being real. Part of that has meant that it is the stated goal of many educational institutions, Jewish institutions, so on and so forth, to get people to love Israel. You just mentioned there's fewer and fewer things that make you love Israel. At least for me, I don't want anyone to love Israel. I don't want anyone to love America. I don't want people to love nation states. I feel deeply connected to Israel, where 40% of our people live, where Jews are sovereign, where Jewish values reign supreme.
Now, what does that mean? Because all I can think of is the bombing every
You
day
mean
of all these
Ben
people.
Gavir's Jewish family? Yeah.
Those are Jewish values too. They are. And Jewish holidays and Jewish culture and Jewish, right. Israel is a place where Jews are the bad guys and the good guys, and Jews are the fascists, and Jews are the Democrats, and Jews are. So I try not to peddle mythology of love for Israel. I don't try to get our teens to love Israel. I try to get them to feel connected to Jewish peoplehood. I try to get them to understand the reality of Israel, the beautiful parts, the terrible parts, the really ordinary parts. But I would never tell you to love Israel. I love Jews. I try to get people to love Jews, but that's
All of
different.
them?
Yeah, some of them.
Some of them.
Some of them. Paul.
Yeah, what's funny? I'm reading a great book. It's called Future Tense by the Honorable and late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. And he's describing, you talk about the history of Judaism from 45 to probably around 70 to 80. It's just a repeat. This is just in a much grander war right now. But it's the same thing over and over. That was one comment. But the question is, what if they would have just kept the name Palestine instead of changing it to Israel?
Names always have politics, right? Remember, the Romans renamed the region Palestine to de-Eudenize it, 1,800 years ago. Jason, and then we're going to move to Story of Us and away from Israel.
Yeah, Rabbi Daniel, just wanted to say that right before you bringing up the map of the Israeli settlements, that thing you said just before that seems to be the thematic and narrative crux of this entire course, the construct of the thinning of American Jewry and the anticipation on the part of Israel that American Jewry will slowly evaporate. I mean, that strikes me as the existential crux of this course in many respects. Yeah. Just wanted to say that.
And there you go. That brings us not only to today, but to tomorrow. By the way, I don't think that that's necessarily a given. It's worth remembering that in the 1950s, Jewish sociologists predicted that Orthodoxy had 20 years left before it was gone entirely. Elliot.
This may get ahead of yourself or putting you on the spot more than you want, but are you suggesting that American Jews kind of begin disentangling our Jewish identity from Israel, or Israel from our Jewish identity, given the directions we're going in?
I guess I'm mostly being descriptive when I say this rather than prescriptive. That has been what Jewish American identity is, and that it is changing. And I do think it's changing. I think when I talk to Jews who call themselves anti-Zionist Jews, that is not a phrase I use to describe myself. But when I talk to anti-Zionist Jews, that's what they mean most of all, generally, is that they want a Jewish identity that is not about Israel. And they often mean that much more than they mean anything about Israeli politics, which is interesting and not how I would have guessed the understanding of that identity. I think that is happening, but we're also seeing a bifurcation where the most intense Jews in their Jewish identity in the United States are becoming the most right-wing Jews. And so, look, if you're talking prescriptive now, the closest I get to that is how I teach our ninth graders. We're talking Israel and anti-Semitism this year. And prescriptively, I want them to feel deeply connected to the Jewish people. I want them to acknowledge the remarkable fact that we live in a moment of Jewish sovereignty, and that has not been true for most of Jewish history, and that sovereignty brings moral responsibility, including to us as American Jews, in all sorts of different ways. So that's the closest I get to prescriptive there, if that makes sense. Okay, I want to back away from this. By the way, we're doing the tribes of Israel during Beit Midrash, November, starting on Wednesdays. Starting next Wednesday, assuming things go well on Tuesday, otherwise Wednesday will be a different topic. But starting next Wednesday, assume things go well the day before, we will have Beit Midrash on the contemporary tribes of Israel. We're going to look at these religious nationalists and secularists and try to understand these real identities that are happening there. Okay, let's back away. We've got 12 minutes left of Story of Us after a year of learning. So we just talked about the relationship of American Jewish identity to the sovereign nation state of Israel in 2024. We started this story that led to that point at 1250 BCE with a group of the grandchildren or great-grandchildren of refugees from Egyptian enslavement who had settled in the northern mountain regions of the West Bank. Do we know I had to Google the name, I always forget it, but the ship of Theseus? It's this Greek myth, right? That if you sail a ship across the ocean and you slowly replace all the wooden boards as they go bad, and by the time you get to the other side of the ocean, none of the wooden boards are the same as when you... Is it the same ship? That's the story of the Jewish people. We've radically transformed who we are, what it means to be a Jew, what the nature of identity is, what we believe, what we don't believe. Right? One way of telling the story of us is to say that we went from polytheists to monotheists to radical monotheists to atheists. Right? It's the old joke that to be a Jew is to believe in no more than one God. But for a long time, to be a Judean actually meant you believed in lots of gods. There is almost nothing that is the same. Right? That's the other, I think, big message that I have tried to convey.
The human body has all of the atoms have changed.
All the atoms in your body. Yes, exactly.
And yet we consider ourselves
the same person. Yep. We're an entire... Sorry, we're getting noises over here. Jewish identity is entirely different. We are not place-based in the same way, even as we have returned back to place. We don't have the same set of values. We don't have the same set of beliefs. And yet we are a continuous tribe. One generation to another, to another, to another. What I had started to say before the alarm started going off here is that in some ways this course is really an anti-Orthodox course. I don't mean it as opposed to Orthodoxy, but Orthodoxy presents its understanding of Jewish history today as being actual Jewish history. It imagines that the Jewish identity and the Jewish practice of the most intensely Jewish people today would be recognizable to Moses or to Rabbi Akiva or to the Chafetz Chaim or to other moments in Jewish history. And I think the real thesis here is that no, our Judaism would be radically unrecognizable to our ancestors, whose Judaism would be radically unrecognizable to their ancestors, all the way back. All the way back.
But doesn't the core assumption that this was handed down to us from God?
So even that doesn't go all the way back, right?
No, but I meant for Orthodoxy.
Oh, yeah,
Isn't
right.
that why it's so much the same?
Exactly. Orthodoxy views this that it is sort of the core thing handed down by God. And what I've tried to show over the course of this year is that 1,000 years ago, that's not what Jews believed. 500 years ago, that's not quite what Jews believed. Certainly 2,500 years ago, that's not at all what Jews believed. So you go back in time to the people who the Orthodox today would say were the ones who God spoke to, and they'd be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. Not just about the God part, but about all of it, the Torah, so I'm interested to open this up for a moment. How has this approach impacted, changed, affected you, your Jewishness, any thoughts, any responses, anything to this year as a whole of learning? Annette, did I see a hand up? Was that?
I was just going to ask if you can say the same thing about Christianity that you say about Judaism, that it has changed so radically.
Yes. I mean, I think any socially constructed identity and group that is true of. What I think is not unique, but certainly noteworthy, is that so many American Jews, even outside of the Orthodox world, buy the Orthodox mythology of Judaism as being inherently correct. We imagine that our great-great-grandparents lived in the shtetl where Orthodox Jews like today, and that is radically untrue. Miriam.
Yes, I couldn't agree more. I'm absolutely thrilled with your conclusion because it puts into words what I have been thinking for a long time. And I just wonder how or when you think we will ever get over the hypocrisy that governs our rituals now, in which we pretend also, as many of the Orthodox must pretend, to believe in the original mythology. So we'd have to go back to, what's his name? Reuben, the Detroit, not atheist, but secular rabbi.
Oh, yeah.
Never mind, you know what I mean.
I guess I don't think it's ever going away because I think we find that same dynamic. In some ways, that's the dynamic of thinking of authenticity and antiquity as being the same thing, or we find it always. We find it in the ways that King Josiah's court in the 620s talked about and mythologized King David. We find it in the ways that the Jews in the early 1800s mythologized the Sanhedrin, even as they were creating the Napoleonic Sanhedrin. We find it in the right there over and over again. We find the same dynamic. So I guess I think it's probably human.
Yeah.
Who you're thinking of?
I'm just thinking, if you believe the prediction made that you quoted before that Judaism won't be alive or around in a few generations, then you don't have to worry about that.
There you go.
I mean, so.
I do.
They're not saying that. They're saying American Judaism.
American Judaism, and it's not even just American Judaism. It's American liberal Jewish identity. Look, I do think it's clear that the Jewish future in America, and I mean my grandkids, I don't mean radically far into the future, is going to be significantly more Orthodox than today. I forget the number, but it's something like Orthodox are 9% of all American Jews and 30% of Jews under 25 or something. That is going to shift everything. Everything. It's going to shift what is normative Jewish identity. It's going to shift how Jews vote. It's going to shift.
It's going to shift our assimilation.
It's going to shift our assimilation. It's also going to shift the environment that liberal Jews are growing up and living in. You know, my grandkids are going to experience a lot more orthodoxy than I did, probably, which is going to shift them and shift those Orthodox Jews.
Isn't there another possibility?
There's lots of
Okay.
possibilities. I mean, a meteor could
I
hit,
mean-
and that'd be it.
I mean,
It's-
if reform reformed itself, if reform reformed and went by other religious precepts like holiness, good behavior, good ethics, changed old Jewish values to new old Jewish values. Wouldn't people be Jewish if Jews were fighting for?
You know, I think that is
Oh.
happening, and that is changing, and reform is reforming itself, and reform will be replaced. The process that led to reform will happen again, right? If you get enough Orthodox young people, they're not all going to stay Orthodox, but also the traditions of Reform Judaism are maybe not going to appeal to them at all. We see this in Israel today, where by and large the Reform movement has failed. There's Reform shuls, but it's filled with Anglos, it's filled with American Jews in Israel. But there are absolutely Israeli progressive Jewish movements and responses that are happening, which in that sense are the values of reform. But Israelis look at Reform Judaism and they say, this tastes like diaspora to me. Why do I need to eat diaspora here? Because they're right. It was built for a different moment, a different experience. And
But the idea that those people are better adherents to Jewish values is ridiculous.
yes, yeah. It's all ridiculous, right? We are as authentic of an interpreter of Jewish values and Jewish mythology as anyone who has ever lived.
Neil Gilman, who is a rabbi who taught at the conservative seminary, his theory, and I really have bought it, is that every generation of Jews is supposed to take the Shema and the rest of Jewish theology, and they're supposed to redo it for themselves. And I think what we're saying is that we are the products of that, and Judaism, at least as we know it, will not exist in 3 or 4 generations. It will change.
Just as
And
it didn't exist as we know it
Right.
3 or 4 generations ago. Exactly. And that's the story of
The
us.
story of us will continue.
That's the story of us. We change, and we need to change because the world changes, our experiences change, our concept of God changes and should change.
Roger.
Thank you. I tuned in, as it turns out, to the last day of this course. It's kind of like showing up for the last day of calculus. You have an exam and you put up these questions. It's like a nightmare. You don't know where to begin. So, listening to all this is kind of depressing and perplexing, illuminating, all of the above. But I have to say this, based upon what I've been hearing, and tell me, Rabbi, if I'm correct. There was that old adage that somebody asked Hillel, tell him what this is all about. And he said something to the effect of, do unto others as you want others to do unto you, and the rest is commentary, go study. Is that not the case anymore?
That's certainly one telling of what it means to be a Jew. Right, and that has always been one of these frames. That's a frame that goes all the way back to you shall not oppress the stranger, the orphan, and the widow, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It's the same idea there. Maybe this will be a good piece to end Story of Us with, and I've referenced this at different moments over the years, but the Holocaust taught very different lessons, identity lessons and values lessons to American Jews and to Israelis. So when American Jews say never again, we usually mean never again shall we allow the systematic murder and genocide of human beings as European Christendom did to its Jews. You'll notice I very particularly did not say the Nazis, but European Christendom. Israelis, when they say never again, generally mean never again will Jews go easily to the slaughter, and never again will Jewish life be cheap.
How are those different?
Oh, they're very different.
Very different concepts.
Very different. For Israelis, never again means if you do something like October 7th, we are going to destroy your society so that never again does someone think Jewish life is cheap, and never again can someone try to take Jewish life like this.
And what does it mean to prohibit?
But American Jews, by and large, never again means let's put signs on the corners of our synagogues about Darfur. And let's be involved in protecting trans kids from state governments. And let's never again has very different meanings in these two different societies. One is about never again shall they do this to us. One is about never again shall this happen to the vulnerable. And this describes two really different Jewish responses to this moment, but also I think two very different Jewish sociologies that exist today. Okay, we're at 6:32, and I got to go teach Intro to Judaism at Sheremetz, so I got to schlep it out of here.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rabbi.
They're getting Story of Us in 4 weeks instead of a year is what I'm doing for their intro. And oh my God, I got complaints that it was too political last week. I don't. Wait till we get to Israel if they think it's too political.
Well, years ago, you did it in 4 weeks.
Oh yeah, I did do a 4-week version of this at CRC years and years ago. And the next time that I teach Story of Us at CRC, it'll be a short one. It won't be a long one.
What are you going to publish?
I don't know. This will get published at some point. I think its first publication will be as TikToks. That's my. Yeah.
Thank you for the year.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
So again, just as a reminder, Tuesdays starting in 2 weeks will be text study, much more like Talmud. We're going to be studying Maimonides, though. Wednesdays, 5 o'clock, in person only. Tuesdays is Zoom only. Is going to be topics each month. The tribes of contemporary Israel for this month. And Thursdays starting in November will be Torah from scratch in person at CRC at noon. Bring your lunch.
Is that, are you going to do any Hebrew roots and stuff like that?
We'll touch a little bit of Hebrew roots, but mostly we're going to be